Hello class, welcome to our third lecture in our series on Western civilization, 1500 to the present. The topic of our lecture today will be the French Revolution of 1789. The main themes and questions we'll be dealing with in today's lecture are first and foremost, how did the American Revolution impact the experience of French revolutionaries? Number two, what were the values of French revolutionaries? Number three, what were the problems of the French Revolution? And number four, asking the question, what factor did nationalism play in the French experience? Or in other words, how did the French Revolution give birth to the rise of modern nationalism? While the French Revolution did not occur until the summer of 1789, its origins started about 20 years earlier in 1776 with the American Revolution. There are two major factors we need to identify about how the American Revolution impacted the French Revolution. First and foremost, the American experience with revolution, which gained our independence from Great Britain, was inspired primarily by French ideals of the Enlightenment. With the Enlightenment, philosophers had spent well over 100 years talking about ideas, but hadn't ever actually tried to put these ideas into practice. The importance of the American Revolution in 1776 was this is the first time in the modern period that people took ideas of the Enlightenment and tried to put them in practice with the creation of a new republic. One of the most important factors to understand about the American Revolution was that its success did not lie primarily in the strength of Americans, but in the fact that 2 years into the Revolution, Louis XVI, the King of France, decided to intervene and to assist revolutionaries here in the United States. Even though Louis XVI was no fan of American ideas of equality or democracy, he was interested in assisting any power in the world that had wanted to take revenge against Great Britain, who was France's most mortal ally in global politics. Now, when French troops came and assisted the American revolutionaries, they fought under the slogan of no taxation without representation. After fighting under the slogan, French soldiers came back to France radicalized by these ideas, also saying to the French monarch that they also did not want to pay taxes unless they had a political voice. Number two, in terms of the actual impact of finances on France. Not only did France assist America with actual soldiers, but Louis XVI bankrolled the entire experience of the American Revolution. Coming out of this, Louis XVI thought that any trade going on with the Americas once the American Revolution was successful would more than assist him in gaining back the revenue from any debts they'd incurred in financing the American Revolution. The problem for Louis XVI on this is once Americans had succeeded in our revolution, we turned our backs on our French allies and started signing trade agreements with Great Britain, essentially leaving this Louis XVI out to dry and completely bankrupt. The greatest problem for Louis when it came to this was that he not only had he drained his own finances, but he had borrowed money from other European powers. By the year 1789, his own finance minister, Calonne, told Louis that by the next year, not only would France be so bankrupt that it could never pay off the debts, but that France was so poor in terms of its royal finances that France wouldn't even be able to make the minimum payments on the interest on its debts, let alone ever pay these things down. Louis quickly realized in 1789 that if he defaulted on these debts, it could potentially destabilize the entirety of Europe. What he decided to do in June of 1789 was bring together a legislative body in the French government that was called the Estates General. The Estates General was an old ancient tradition of the French people, but it hadn't been called into stage since the year 1614. Under the rule of Louis's predecessors, French monarchs tried to enforce an absolutist vision of politics, not believing that they needed to have any type of advice or assistance from a legislative body. What the American Revolution then did is set the stage for the French Revolution, of seeing new ideas put into action and bankrupting a corrupt and oppressive government ruling over France. As previously stated, the Estates General was an ancient legislative body, part of the French government, that was rarely called into action and activity by French monarchs. The Estates General represented directly the different segments of French society, one segment representing the church, one segment representing the nobility, and one segment representing commoners. Very similar to the setup we saw in our first lecture on feudalism, only French society was far more stratified. In France, the Church, the Roman Catholic Church, represented about 130,000 people, which was less than 1% of the entire population. The Second Estate represented the aristocracy or nobility, approximately 350,000 people, which was less than 2% of French society. And the Third Estate, which was given equal voting abilities with the First and Second Estate, represented the middle class, the urban poor, and peasants, approximately 26.5 million people, or about 98% of French society. The problem with this setup was the entire French system was rigged. The church and the nobility and the Third Estate were all given equal voting powers when it came to this body, which meant that the church and the nobility, who represent less than 3% of French society, could come together as a voting bloc and block the will of the other 98% of the people living in France at all times. What had occurred during this time, when the Estates General came together, was the Third Estate, instead of simply accepting this rigged system and accepting that the French people would not have their voices heard, as they declared themselves the National Assembly and the official government of France, saying that they would not disband as the National Assembly until, number one, Louis XVI recognized their legitimacy, and number two, until a new constitution was written for the French government where the French people would have a say in how government affairs were run. When the National Assembly refused to disband before drafting a new constitution, Louis XVI declared this legislative body to be illegal, and declared also that any supporters of the National Assembly in Paris were also committing acts of treason against the French government. Rumors began to circulate around Paris that Louis was going to send troops into the capital city to crush out any supporters of the revolutionary movement. In order to make sure that this could not occur, veterans of the American Revolution, who had been radicalized by ideas of the American Revolution, took matters into their own hands, and on July 14, 1789, seized a building in downtown Paris called the Bastille. Traditionally, the Bastille had been a royal prison where the king was allowed to put whoever he wanted into this prison for whatever reason and hold them there for however long that he wanted. It is essentially a symbol of kings running countries through absolutist rule. What's also important to understand about the Bastille is it was the main royal armory for the royal guard there in Paris. What occurred there at the Bastille was initially a violent fight between revolutionaries and between soldiers who were guarding the Bastille. After several hours of fighting, those soldiers who were supposed to be guarding the Bastille switched sides and joined in with the revolutionaries of Paris. What occurred now at this point was that the revolutionaries in Paris were able to seize the guns of the Bastille. They were able to convince Louis' guards and soldiers to switch sides, and now, as Chairman Mao Zedong will repeat in the 20th century, political power came from the barrel of a gun. Without having the guns to protect him or the soldiers to protect him, Louis realized that he was in for some real trouble. The National Assembly also realized, now that the people of Paris were heavily armed and radicalized and confident, that they could push forward in drafting a new constitution. On August 26, 1789, the National Assembly published what was called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, essentially very similar to the blending of the American Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution. What people in Paris started doing now that they were heavily armed was threatening any supporters of Louis and utilizing violence and oftentimes acts of terrorism against supporters of the king in the name of the revolution and of the revolutionary principles of the French nation. What truly sealed the fate of Louis XVI and the future of the French monarchy had less to do with political ideas and more to do with poor people starving and deciding to take matters into their own hand. 1788 and 1789 had been incredibly poor harvest years in France, and since about 98% of the French diet is made up of bread during this time, it meant that poor harvests meant bread shortages, and bread shortages meant starvation. What occurred on the morning of October 8, 1789, is women, as they usually did in Paris, went off to the bakeries to stand in bread lines to purchase bread for the families that day. For the fact that there was a grain shortage going on, women realized that morning that there was no bread to be purchased. Instead of simply accepting the fate of their families potentially starving, approximately 7,000 poor women from the heart of the city of Paris marched 15 miles out to the Palace of Versailles, broke down the royal gates, marched into the palace, and kidnapped the entire royal family, saying that they were going to hold Louis and his family under arrest in the name of the people until the poor of Paris were being fed once again. Emboldened by this move, on October 9, 1789, these same women gathered the entire royal family and marched them to Paris and said they were now under arrest. The problem in this scenario is many European radicals who despised Louis XVI and embraced ideas about democracy and republican rule absolutely were thrilled by the idea that people were taking matters into their own hands and starting to advance ideas about equality. People who were nobles or people who were monarchs were terrified by the French Revolution and despised what was going on in France. Many of them feared that the revolutionary ideas, particularly the activity of the poor people of Paris, would be like an infection that would infect the entire body of Europe and quickly spread over France's borders and potentially destabilize the entire feudal system of the European continent. While the poor of France were avid supporters of revolutionary politics, particularly ideas about equality and citizenship, the nobility of France were horrified by the revolutionary perspectives being brought forward by the government. Many of them believed that these ideas about equality were going to be like an infection that would infect the entire body of Europe, as we mentioned in our previous slide. What many of these nobles did during the first year of the revolution was fled France and became political refugees in the kingdoms of Austria and Prussia. While living in Austria and Prussia, they started plotting against French revolutionaries to attempt to bring King Louis XVI back to his throne and to crush out any revolutionary momentum going on. The first step in their plan was attempted to be executed on June 20, 1791, of what's referred to as the Flight to Versailles. The idea was for the entire French royal family to dress up as peasants and that they would be snuck out of the country where they could become a rallying symbol for French aristocrats to come back to overthrow the revolutionary government and to put King Louis XVI firmly back in power. The problem is while King Louis XVI and his family were willing to dress up as peasants, he found it beneath his own dignity and status to ride in a peasant's cart. He demanded that he be allowed to leave the country in his royal carriage, which sort of defeated the idea of being dressed up as a peasant. What occurred when they attempted to flee the country on June 20th was that a guard who recognized Louis's face on a coin as the same man who was dressed as a peasant in this royal carriage stopped the carriage, realized it was the royal family trying to escape, and had the entire family put under arrest once again. When Louis was returned to the city of Paris, he was stripped essentially of all powers and now became a prisoner of the French revolutionary government. What the Austrian and Prussian kingdoms did now at this point was they thought that they were protecting Louis, but instead they sealed a fate of destruction for him. On August 27, 1791, these two kingdoms issued a joint declaration called the Declaration of Pillnitz, saying that if Louis and the family were threatened in any way, shape, or form, that Austria and Prussia would launch a joint invasion of France, topple the French government, and to restore Louis to power. The problem for Louis in this scenario is since more and more French people were identifying with the revolution, particular ideas about patriotism and nationalism, they now saw Louis no longer as their king, but as a potential agent of foreign powers who were threatening to launch a military invasion of their own country. What French revolutionaries decided to do on April 20th, 1792 is to launch what we call in modern times a preemptive war to make sure that Austria and Prussia could not threaten the revolution. When they launched this revolutionary war on April 20th, they justified it with themes of patriotism and political violence at home. What occurred on September 21st, 1792 was that Louis was declared to be a traitor to the French people, was declared to no longer be king, and now that the king was no longer given any political power, France now became a republic. For the fact that Louis was being portrayed as a traitor to the French nation, traditionally what happens when people are found guilty of treason is they are executed. On January 21st, 1793, under charges that Louis had been conspiring against the French people and conspiring with the kingdoms of Austria and Prussia, Louis was found guilty of treason and beheaded in front of cheering crowds in France. What French revolutionaries now did with their war going across Europe is they started having their soldiers going out and fighting under the slogan liberty, equality, fraternity. We all know what the terms liberty and equality mean in many ways when it comes to political ideology. But fraternity in this context is not like the modern word fraternity when we talk about fraternities on college campuses. Fraternity in this context would be a synonym for solidarity. Fraternity meant, well, essentially, fraternity was a promise from French troops that if other people throughout Europe wanted to overthrow their kings and overthrow the nobility who ruled over the land, that France would provide the finances, the soldiers, and the revolutionary spirit to topple every single king and queen throughout the Europe. What this meant now was that other European powers now perceived France as a threat to the entire social order, and an international coalition with Great Britain at the head was put together to try and topple the revolutionary government of France. With Louis XVI now dead, and a revolutionary spirit of republics sweeping across Europe, a new strongman came to power with the French Revolution by the name of Maximilien Robespierre. As leader of the French Republic, Robespierre believed in strict social equality and promoting the interests primarily of the poor people of Paris. Robespierre was seen by the poor as, quote, a man of virtue, because he was willing to use violence and terror if necessary to take care of the interests of the majority of French people who were incredibly poor. What Robespierre did with the powers of government is, for the first time in the modern era, use the powers of government to completely regulate the French economy, fixing prices on staple products such as bread and providing jobs for the unemployed. While this was incredibly popular with the poor of Paris, it became increasingly unpopular with other French revolutionaries. Much like the dictator of the Soviet Union in the early 20th century, Joseph Stalin, many other revolutionaries feared this man who was bent on flexing his own political will through violence and through terror. More and more, Robespierre portrayed anyone who spoke out against him as traitors against the revolution, against the French nation, and that the only way to deal with traitors and treason was through executions, particularly utilizing the guillotine as a form of political terror. If you're not aware of what the guillotine is, you've seen it many times in traditional films. It's essentially a contraption where you lay your head down and blade comes down and chops off your head. So essentially, Robespierre says, if you oppose me, then you oppose the French people. If you oppose the French people, then you must be a traitor. And the way we deal with your traitors is we chop off your heads. For the fact the revolution was getting so radical and trying to enforce social equality through political violence, the revolution started crumbling apart during the summer of 1794. What other French revolutionaries did was they conspired against Robespierre, fearing that they may also become victims of political violence. They overthrew Robespierre and also had him executed as a traitor to the French people. Once Robespierre was out of power, government regulations on the economy were almost overnight removed, which meant that the price of bread started skyrocketing, unemployment started skyrocketing, and the poor of Paris no longer felt as if their own interests were being represented in the revolution. To make sure that people like Robespierre did not come to power again, the French government started utilizing violence against poor people and radicals to make sure that they were not able to flex their own political weight when it came to the revolution. The great question then, when it came to democratic revolutions, was the question, which is more important, equality or stability? What we'll see by the years 1794 and 1795 is that French revolutionaries increasingly believed that stability was far more important than idealistic notions of equality. While the French Revolution was rooted in the experiences of the American Revolution, ideologically, it was essentially a critique of the American Revolution initially, particularly our own limitations on ideas of equality and political participation. What occurred in 1795, after the French Revolution had spiraled out of control and violence, is the creation of a new constitution for the French Republic and a new government that historians have referred to as the Directory government. This new constitution that was put in place in August of 1795 split up the French legislative branch. Instead of simply having one body, a National Assembly, you created a two-body legislative branch very similar to our own Congress. You created a Council of 500, which is a lower body very similar to our House of Representatives, and a Council of the Ancients, a higher body very similar to the U.S. Senate that could put checks and vetoes on any legislation brought forward by the Council of 500. This new constitution also abolished universal suffrage, now limiting the right to vote to only wealthy white males, essentially mimicking the American system that existed in 1795. The one thing that was quite different with the French system, though, is instead of putting executive power in the hands of one individual, a president, is the executive branch was created what was called the Directory, where you had 5 individuals who shared power and had supreme authority over the French nation, but who could keep each other from essentially acting like dictators. While this helped to stabilize many aspects of the French revolutionary experience, the nobility of France were still unhappy, many of them still being political refugees living in Austria and Prussia. The other group that was very unhappy was the Roman Catholic Church. Since the Roman Catholic Church had traditionally controlled all aspects of French politics and French society, they were still very unhappy with the secular revolutionary government that had undermined the traditional politics of France. The only way the Directory government was able to stay in power for several years was by relying upon the strength and the skill of a young aspiring general by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. What occurred during the last year of the Directory government is essentially the creation of what we would call a counter-revolution and a military coup, where General Napoleon Bonaparte, by 1799, overthrows the French Republic, installs himself as supreme leader, and declares himself Emperor of France in the year 1801. Napoleon is an individual who we will explore in our next lecture to understand how Napoleon transformed the politics of revolutionary France and in many ways transformed the politics of the entire Western world.